Caribe Radio nos proponemos ser la emisora online calificada para ser la mejor opción en comunicación para usted. Nos preparamos en noticias, deportes, cultura, música y de entretenimiento general para que usted esté conectado todo el tiempo con nosotros. Caribe Radio ofrece el mejor servicio de comunicación digital para que las empresas se hagan visibles a diferentes públicos. Desde lo público trabajamos para el servicio y por el servicio social. Caribe Radio Online nos entrenamos día a día para brindar la mejor opción en producción de medios digitales. Caribe Radio, la radio del futuro.
Los conceptos, productos y servicios del siguiente espacio son responsabilidad del director del programa y no representan el pensamiento de esta emisora.
Good afternoon. This is Discussions with Authors, part of Books Over Drinks, an online community meant to foster the passion for books by providing a platform for both authors and readers to exchange ideas and discuss their work. We're pleased to welcome Dr. Henry G. To discuss his book, A Very Short History of Life on Earth. Dr. G is a paleontologist and an evolutionary biologist. He has a PhD in zoology from the University of Cambridge, and he's now the senior editor for the scientific journal Nature. This is a beautifully written and carefully crafted book that takes readers through a journey billions of years in the making, from the formation of our solar system in the aftermath of a supernova to the appearance of cyanobacteria responsible for the oxygenation of the atmosphere and oceans, to the first known multicellular animal life and the Cambrian explosion that saw these organisms evolve into complex animals that preceded the vertebrae that ultimately leaped into land and further evolved. This book is thorough, devoting almost a quarter of its pages to detailed notes and references. It is certainly written for a general audience, but does not limit itself to generalities, and rather offers detailed accounts on the history of life on Earth, transient and ever-changing, yet long-lasting. The book has an enormous pedagogic value, yet it is as entertaining and engaging as reading any sci-fi story. This is a book we're certain you'll enjoy from cover to cover. So Dr. G, thank you so much for joining us today. We're happy to have you.
Thank you very much for welcoming me. And you are Books Over Drinks. So I've got I had just finished my mug of English tea. There we are.
Oh, well,
cheers.
Cheers. So why don't we start? I love the fact that the book delivers a treasure trove of interesting explanations for some of the features that organisms developed and that we all take for granted, but had great significance. One of which was the development of the mouth and the anus, as it impacted not just the way that organisms consumed energy and disposed waste, but had a profound effect on sea life in the Ediacaran period. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yes, the anus is one of the great underappreciated features of evolution. In fact, if it wasn't for the butthole, there wouldn't be us around to talk about it. What happened was, in the early ocean, most creatures were very, very tiny, too small to see. Some were starting to get large enough that you could have seen them with the naked eye. But this posed a problem. When a creature is very small, it can get all the food it needs just absorbing through its surface, and it can get rid of the wastes just by diffusing it through its surface. But when a creature, a bacterium, a cell is bigger than a tiny dot, it starts to get its insides, the insides of its insides are really a long way from the surface. So it's quite difficult to get things in, food in and waste out again without some specialized structure. So some creatures started to have a mouth. They formed a cup shape like a polyp, like sea anemones. Corals do this now. And the food goes into the inside, but that's also where the wastes come out again. Now, this is fine if you are a creature that basically stays in one place all the time, watching the scenery go by and absorbing everything you need through this surface. However, just before the dawn of animal life, some enterprising worms evolved a gut that went through. It wasn't an in and out in the same place. Things went in one end and out the other end. Now, going back to the cup-shaped polyp and small creatures, feces or wastes were diffused in a general wash into the ocean, all through the water column, and feeding on this waste were decay bacteria, and decay bacteria consume oxygen. So what this meant was the whole ocean was essentially stagnant, free of oxygen. And any creature larger than a dot needs lots of oxygen to breathe. So that was a break on evolution. But then these worms that invented the mouth and the anus, they started to process the food that went through them in different ways. So what came out was not a general waste, but a pellet of feces, which was heavy, and it could fall to the bottom of the ocean. And with the development, this rain of poo down to the bottom, all the bacteria went to the bottom as well. So all the decay happened right up the ocean floor, and that freed up the rest of the ocean to become oxygenated. And when the oxygen happened, larger animals could evolve. So it was the invention of the anus. Be nice to your bottom. You have a lot to thank for it for. In fact, I think there is quite a connection. I always have good ideas while sitting on the john. That's.
No, it was certainly fascinating to find out about that. And you mentioned also that the early land masses on Earth were inert, and there was no soil at the time.
It was all volcanic rock. I mean, when you go to places on the Earth where there are active volcanoes, like Hawaii or Iceland or somewhere like that, all the rock comes out and it cools, and you have these amazing volcanic landscapes. I remember going on a vacation with my wife years ago to the island of Lanzarote in the Canary Islands, and you go up to the volcano, which is still active, and it seems like a prehistoric landscape. And that's quite true, because all landscapes were like that. They were just bare rock, no soil, just the bare rock, and that's how land masses originated. I mean, the early Earth had no land when it was just ocean, and it was the volcanic eruptions that brought land to the surface and basically created more land. So the amount of land in the Earth's history has been slowly increasing over time.
And you said that soil, I mean, you are not going to find soil, because you mentioned that soil is the byproduct not just of Earth, but living organisms that enrich. Land.
That's right. I mean, volcanic soil is very fertile. It's got lots of minerals in it. But to get soil is the most. It just looks like dirt, right? But it's the most amazing substance. It's full of billions of organisms, bacteria, little cells, tiny worms, little insects, and they all have a community, all eating things, all excreting things, all digesting, making more organic matter, compost, the dead bodies, fertilizing the soil, and slowly building up a layer, and also breaking up the rock underneath. Eroding the water, and the weather will erode it into soil. And it's when you get soil that you can have plants rooting and fungi growing in it. So soil is very much a byproduct of living organisms.
So what prompted those organisms to reach for land in the first place? If there was really nothing there but volcanic soil or soil. Sorry. If
life had a motto, it would be whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And if there is an empty opportunity to make a living, however slight, some living organism will take it. So there were lots of creatures in the sea, but nothing at all on land. And back in those early days, for any creature to go onto land would be would be like going into space. There was anything in the sea. It's a nice even temperature. Your weight is supported by the water. The oxygen just diffuses in through your gills or your body or whatever. But on land, the temperature varies enormously. It's desiccating. You'll be dried out, and you're heavy. You feel your weight. So it's very, very hard. So it took a long time, and it started over 1 billion years ago when some very simple fungi, lichens, algae discovered fresh water. They discovered it. Their spores would land on the volcanic rock, and of course most would die, but some found little lakes and rivers and formed little crusts and scum around the edges. And slowly animals in the sea would come up onto land. I mean, during the tide, when there were tides into the zone, and they would make little homes under the crusts of the lichen, and early plants would come along. And plants found land great because there was lots of sunshine, unfiltered by water, and plants need lots of sunshine. So quite soon, plants reached for the sky. They evolved hard tissues like wood, so they could grow upwards and fight gravity that would have kept them on the ground. And that, kept them moist inside. So some of the most primitive plants, like mosses, always live close to water because they have no defense against being dried out. But the plants would move away, and then they would drop leaves and bark and detritus onto the floor. And in these first forests, the first little animals to go on land, which were like little relations of insects and spiders, very small creatures, and they would scuttle under the leaves, and they wouldn't be eating the leaves because eating plant matter is quite difficult. They would eat each other, so they would have tiny little to the death battles underneath all the leaf litter. And this all went on for millions and millions of years. And one of the last major kinds of creature to come onto the land were the vertebrates, the fish. Now, there are fish that live in great depths of the ocean, and there are fish that live near the shallow water. So they're fish that live in different depths of the water. Well, there were some fish that lived very close to the surface in fresh water and in the sea, and sometimes they would find themselves living in water of negative depth. So they would come to a fish, the land is water of negative depth, and they would find ways to live on the land. They did evolve legs, but the legs were pretty useless for climbing on land to begin with. They were mostly creatures of very shallow water, but they came onto land and started to hunt the little insects, and these were the first amphibians, what we call the tetrapods, the four-legged. Basically, all of us are tetrapods. We're a very strange, peculiar lineage of fish that live out of water.
Yeah, you said that they in the book you mentioned that they replace fins for digits. And,
yes. Sorry,
carry
on.
No, go ahead.
No. Oh, well, firstly, they weren't very serious about digits because we all have 5 digits on each limb. It's the primitive number. Most things have 5 at most. Occasionally they're reduced. But the earliest tetrapods had 6, 7, 8 and on each limb. And it was quite a while before they started taking legs seriously and setting out, stabilizing on the number 5. This is so much a feature that when you see creatures today with more than 5 digits a limb, it's seen as a abnormal, a strange mutation. I mean, there are some cats, some breeds of cats that tend to have more than 5 digits, and it's a kind of result of inbreeding. I think these are the Maine Coons that have loads and loads of toes.
And the one characteristic that appears to have broken the bond between animals and the sea was the ability to lay eggs. And and even in the case of plants, I think with seeds.
Yes.
So you mentioned that egg laying is efficient. offering a self-sustaining pod for embryos to have with little parental investment.
That's right.
Yeah. So yet certain animals, including almost all mammals that survive today, have evolved to live birth. So when and why did live birth evolve?
Well, that's a good question, because live birth might have evolved very long ago in the first ever fish with jaws. So there are quite a lot of fish now that give birth to live young. Many sharks do it. And some of these early vertebrates called placoderms, these armored fish, they seem to have had live birth. They had internal fertilization, so they mated rather than just laying eggs and spawn. So it could be that live birth was the original condition. But certainly if you look at modern amphibians, you know, frogs and toads and salamanders, they have a huge spectrum of reproduction. Some of them, you know, the familiar frogs, they have spawn in a pond and then they have the tadpoles, but some of them retain the eggs inside the body, and some of them, they're these rare worm-like amphibians called caecilians. They give birth to live young, and they almost like have a placenta. The babies live on maternal tissue inside. So there's actually quite a variation, and a lot of reptiles, lizards and things, give birth to live young. But the major feature that allowed animals to live on land was to create this waterproof egg called the amniotic egg, you know, an egg with a shell. Now, the shells weren't originally hard like a hen's egg. They were leathery, you know, a bit soft, like snake's eggs and things like that. But the thing about them being waterproof was they gave the embryo its own private pond. It's a pond all to itself, and it's got all these compartments in it. It's got the yolk sac, so it's got the food, and it's got a waste sack. It's got a trash can, so it won't poison itself with its own wastes. And it really is like a life support capsule to give the embryo everything it needs until it's big enough to hatch and live on its own. Now, there are some animals, you know, dinosaurs, crocodiles, and birds. All of these are always egg layers, and they really made a big feature of it. But mammals started off as egg layers, and there are very few egg-laying mammals left. Most of the mammals give birth to live young, but there are some, the marsupials, that have got a kind of clever hybrid where they give birth to live young, but the young is really very premature, and it crawls out of the birth canal through the mother's fur and into the little pouch where it attaches itself to a teat and then grows up into a joey. And this is great for animals that live in marginal conditions, because they can abort their embryos very quickly if the conditions look like they're going to be too difficult to raise offspring. But originally, the egg with a shell was the big thing that allowed vertebrates, tetrapods, four-legged animals to live on land, because it finally got rid of their need to go to water to reproduce. And that was the big breakthrough.
Fascinating. There's a point in time in the book where you're so invested as a reader in the complex organisms and these beautiful animals that you describe, that even I gotta say that every time that I saw one of the names, or you were talking about the animal, I would just go on Google and try to find out what it looked like.
Yeah, this is the thing. I didn't have pictures in the book, and that was kind of deliberate. I wanted it to read like a story, because there are lots and lots of books. It's quite easy to find pictures of these. You see, the thing is, nobody really knows what they look like. These are all artist impressions based on bones mostly. But a lot of people want the pictures. So I asked my publishers, hey, why don't we have a slightly longer history of life on Earth with pictures? And they said, hey, Henry, let's see how this one sells first. So, you know, if you all go and buy loads of copies, then maybe my publishers will let me do one with pictures.
Absolutely.
So,
so you're so invested as a reader, and there's a point where you then you hit us with explaining a mass extinction. An event that seems to take back, I mean, at least when you're first starting to read it, to a Precambrian period, or so it seems at the moment that you read it, when you describe the conditions. One of these was the Permian extinction. I think that you devoted a big part of the book, or I mean, to explaining this one in particular. So why was this one so significant?
Well, this one was the most important mass extinction in the last 500 million years at least, you know, and that means it's the most important one that we have any knowledge of. There were probably ones in the deep past when, you know, creatures were bacteria, but the Permian was by far the biggest of the so-called Big Five, of which they're in the fossil record. And it was a kind of perfect storm of lots of dreadful things happened kind of close together. First of all, what happened was all the little continental masses were coming together to create this big supercontinent, Pangaea. And what that meant was there was less coastline. Now, most creatures live in shallow seas, coral reefs. You know, they don't live in the deep sea, they don't live on land, they live in shallow seas around the continents. So if you can imagine lots of continents coming together to make one big continent, that means a lot of the seashores are being squeezed out of existence. So, and so there was a lot of competition for space in the most diverse and competitive part of the ecosystem, which is in the shallow seas. And that was one thing. Also, there was a general decline in plant life. Before the Permian period, there was the Carboniferous period, which was when the coal forests formed. And these plants used carbon dioxide really extravagantly, and so buried it all as coal. That's where almost all the coal deposits of the earth come from. Just this 70 million period of the vast coal forests. But when Pangaea came together, the whole weather systems changed. It became a lot, there were a few coal forests there, but it became a lot drier. And in the Carboniferous, the plants were churning out so much oxygen that some animals could get quite big. There were millipedes the size of carpets, and there were dragonflies the size of seagulls, you know, because there was so much oxygen, they could grow to bigger sizes. But as Pangaea came together, plant life generally declined, so there was less oxygen. And in fact, there was so little oxygen that breathing at sea level would be like trying to take a breath in the high mountains today. So the plants were dying, there was competition for life, there was less oxygen. So it was all, and the interior of Pangaea, you know, when you get into the interior of continents, you get very extreme temperatures, very hot deserts, very cold in the winter, like, you know, in Central Asia, you know, Mongolia or somewhere. It's, you know, incredible extremes of temperature, very challenging. And because Pangaea was so huge, a lot of the central parts were like that. So it was quite hard work for animals. So a lot of animals were finding it hard. And then it was a double whammy. There was a great thunderhead of magma coming up from the earth that punctured a hole in what is now South China. Now, these little plumes of magma do it all the time. There's one under Yellowstone. Hawaii is sitting on the top of one. So is Iceland. These come through all the time, but sometimes they're really very big. And the one in South China came through, and that was a bit of a shame because South China was a little island continent just off Pangaea. It was like the land that time forgot. It had the old Carboniferous forest. It was the last refuge. Well, that magma plume destroyed that, and it filled the atmosphere with carbon dioxide, which caused the greenhouse effect. The temperature spiked, and all sorts of sulfur chemicals that made acid rain. Generally not very nice. Well, not very long after that, a few million years, an even bigger magma plume came up in what is now Siberia, and it covered the whole of Siberia with basalt, with volcanic rock. It became a huge lava field, loads of carbon dioxide, temperatures rising 6 degrees, and there were all sorts of other things that happened. It would spew acid into the atmosphere, mercury vapor, The ozone layer was destroyed by the chlorine compounds. So eventually all the animals were broiled, boiled, fried, and dissolved, because the acids would dissolve the coral reefs. And on land, the plants died from the acid and from the carbon dioxide and the smoke and the soot. And when the plants died, that meant the soil was not held onto the rocks. So a lot of the soil was swept into the sea, and the good old decay bacteria had a good time digesting everything that had fallen into the sea, making the ocean stagnant. It sucked all the oxygen out of the ocean. So the oxygen was full of dead creatures being dissolved, and there was no life. And there was no life on land, well, very little, because it had all been swept away in this kind of apocalyptic hellscape. And 19 out of 20 creatures in species in the sea died, and 7 out of 10 on land. And it was the biggest mass dying that anyone knows about. But it didn't happen overnight. That would have been merciful. It took several million years to happen. And after that, the Earth bounded back hugely, but it took a few million years for the Earth to recover. So that's why I talk about it, because it had apart from an asteroid impact, which happened at the end of the Cretaceous, it had all the ingredients of climate change, continental movement, changes in the atmosphere, volcanic eruptions. Almost everything that could go wrong for life did go wrong all at once. But life, came back, because life's motto is anything that doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Absolutely. There's another thing about the book now, jumping into some of the design of some of the features. I thought it was so interesting how and I was sort of like comparing in my head when you were describing dinosaurs and their design, and the fact that they were so, it looked like they were so efficient animals, like the way that they're structured. When you're talking about predators like the Tyrannosaurus Rex, and even the herbivores that ultimately had to grow large to protect themselves, and or to grow thicker layers to protect themselves from predators. But then compare it against the earlier hominids, when they were walking upright, because you would think okay, that doesn't seem like a very efficient design, yet ultimately I think it was a combination of them. Ultimately, I think that in order to support, like you were mentioning, that in order to support upright walking and all these things that were changing in them, they had to develop bigger brains. And how was that process for hominids?
Oh, well, you see, the thing is, walking upright is just about the worst thing you can possibly do, because the backbone, we're all evolved around the backbone, and the backbone evolved in the sea as a horizontal structure. In engineering terms, it was a horizontal structure held in tension with these muscles. Absolutely marvelous. Fish don't get back problems. It's, they just don't. They don't form long queues at the osteopath saying, I've got a terrible problem. So what the dinosaurs achieved by bipedality, they kept the backbone horizontal, but they had these 2 legs coming down in the middle under the center of gravity, and they had a tail balancing at one end and a body with a head at the other, and so they could move on their hips more or less without any effort, but the backbone was horizontal. So that's the way to be a biped. Hominins, being very strange creatures, actually turned their backbone 90 degrees, so it was held upright in compression, which is not what it was evolved to do. Why they did this, nobody really knows. It might be to do with the fact that some of the early apes started to walk in an upright posture, started to climb in an upright posture. So they were climbing up and down branches. So basically being a biped was just like climbing up and down branches, but without the branches. So that's how it started. But walking on your hind legs on the ground necessitates a complete change in anatomy, physiology, because suddenly gravity is working 90 degrees away from what it used to. And that does awful things to your insides, let alone your back. And it did even more awful things to female hominids, which were pregnant most of the time. So not only did they have to balance, like balancing a pencil on its tip, they had to keep compensating for it as the fetus grew. And of course, because a good way to an efficient way to walk is to have long legs. But of course, if you have long legs, it means your center of gravity is even further from the ground. And so you're even more likely to fall over. So we walk by this amazing way of basically always being slightly out of balance. When you lift one foot off the ground, you're falling into the next step. And when you lift your other foot off the ground, you're in the next step. And this was partly the evolution of the brain, because walking requires immense feats of neuromuscular control. In fact, they're so immense that people still haven't worked out how humans walk. Now, this is one of my favorite subjects. I was going to write a book about walking, but a friend of mine, Jeremy De Silva, has just done one called First Steps, which I've got on. I think I'm swapping my book with his. I'm expecting him to send me one. So Jeremy, if you hear this, you still haven't sent me one. But scientists can now have telescopes that peer to the edges of the universe. Scientists have atom smashers that can tell you what's going on inside an atom, but we still don't know exactly how humans walk. There is no robot that can mimic the beauty and grace of anyone just walking along the street, let alone a gymnast or a ballet dancer, and also how humans learn to walk when they're growing up. You look very young and youthful, sir. You probably have no children at all yet, but I've seen them grow up, and watching children learn to walk is the most amazing thing, that they can walk along and not fall over very often. So when hominins evolved to be bipedal, they had to get very good at it very quickly, because if you fall over and break your leg, you're toast. And if you're living in the wilds, you'll soon be eaten by something. And I discovered this for myself. Wasn't eaten when in 2018. I broke my leg in a trivial accident at home. I just tripped on the stairs. I broke my ankle and I was immobile. And I was only made better by the vast apparatus of Britain's National Health Service. So the ambulance men came, and there were nurses, and I had surgeons and anaesthetists and more nurses and physiotherapists, and the man who came in with cups of tea. And then, when I left home, I had a wheelchair and crutches and more physiotherapists, and it even inspired my wife to retrain to be a nurse, specializing in people with learning difficulties. Go figure. So it was a life-changing experience for everybody. Now, the British National Health Service is the largest employer in Europe, and because of it, I could get better, and I wasn't eaten or left to die, which would have happened to an earlier hominin. So natural selection has made people be very good at walking, and yet it's something we take for granted. There's something else that's a bit different, that's running. That was another big step in evolution. But just standing upright and putting one foot in front of the other without falling over, I think it's one of the most amazing facts of the natural world. And it's something we just take for granted.
I love that part of the book when you talk about how humans evolved to basically just be sprinters and runners, but not fast, but it was endurance, what you were saying, what they had. And it was a combination of sweat glands to cool off the body. So that part was fascinating.
Yeah, I owe a great deal of that to my friend Dan Liebman. He's a professor in Harvard who researches locomotion. He's known as the Barefoot Professor. Not only does he research locomotion, but he really is a marathon runner, and he runs barefoot or in these kind of moccasin type things that early humans would have run. And he studies people in Africa who walk around and run long distances. If you go to Africa, if you go to Kenya, you see people running. They don't walk, they run. It's what people do. This may be why all the best long distance runners in the world come from Kenya or Ethiopia, because they grew up doing it and they've got the physiology and they're used to running like that. But Dan and his colleague Dennis Bramble came up with the idea that sometime in human evolution, probably when Homo erectus evolved, and Homo erectus was the first proper human. All the previous Homo and Australopithecus were basically upright chimpanzees. But Homo erectus had the human shape for long distance running. Now, if you can remember the $6 Million Man, you can see him running along and his legs are out of phase with his arms. So his upper body is moving counterclockwise compared with the lower body. And this is because modern humans and Homo erectus have a waist. We have a distinct waist. We have a kind of pivot. Our rib cage is kind of tight. The earlier hominins had pot bellies and big rib cages, and also their legs were rather short. Well, Homo erectus has long legs, which is more efficient for moving. Also, one thing you notice in chimpanzees is they don't really have a neck. Their body muscles come up and join their neck. In humans, there's a distinct neck that allows the head to stay facing the prize while the arms are rotating. And there is a ligament, all that really keeps us pointing forward. There's a ligament, a strap of chewy gristle that joins the back of our head with the back of our neck and our back. Now, this ligament is a new thing in humans. It's only ever seen in pack hunting animals like dogs. Here is a dog that I prepared earlier. My dog. This is my dog. These are seen in pursuit predators. Now, you mentioned the sweat glands. Well, it was about this time that Homo erectus started to shed body hair and sweated. Most furry animals can't do this. Also, being upright, they had a lesser profile to the sun, and it was easier to shed heat. So one thing humans are very good at now, apart from Usain Bolt, humans are very, very, in terms of the animal world, humans are not very fast sprinters. Many other animals are really good at running fast for very short distances. But one thing that humans are really good at is running slowly for very, very long distances. I mean, people do these ultra marathons and things, and no animals do this. But people used to do this all the time, because what hunters in traditional societies do, they're pack hunters. They have to have several of them. Is they will chase an antelope, and the antelope will always be a bit ahead of them, but they keep chasing it. And when the antelope stops, they will stop. And then the antelope goes on, and then they will chase it, and they'll catch up eventually. And eventually the antelope will just fall down from heat exhaustion. It will just die of heat exhaustion. And that's how hunting dogs do it. That is basically what Homo erectus did. Homo erectus was the first carnivore. It was specialized to be a savanna predator like a hyena or a hunting dog, whereas the Australopithecus lineage specialized in being a herbivore. Like when there was Homo erectus, there was another creature called Paranthropus, which was a specialized vegetarian. It had a huge belly, it had huge teeth, amazing chewing muscles. But these eventually became extinct because the climate of Africa became too difficult to support a hominin with that kind of dietary specialization. And so that's how they died out.
Yeah, wow. There's one thing that reminds me, that you're making me think. I remember reading a while back, but that there was this misconception that many people believe up until this day that Homo sapiens were the only human species running or inhabiting Earth at a time, and not and we're unaware that there were multiple actual human species inhabiting Earth. So how many were there? Did they interact, and why did Homo sapiens ultimately thrive?
Well, it's very interesting. For almost all the time that Homo sapiens has been on Earth, there have been many other hominin species, our cousins. As recently as 50,000 years ago, there were modern humans in Africa, and there were other hominins we don't really know much about in Africa that were not more primitive. And there was, at about that time, humans were in southern Asia and into Ireland, Southeast Asia. But at the same time, there were Neanderthals that lived in Europe and Western Asia, where the climate at the time was much tougher. This was the Ice Age. And then in Eastern Asia, there was another group of creatures called the Denisovans, named after Denisova Cave, where they were first discovered. People don't know much about these. These are mostly known from their genes, but it's possible they first evolved in the Tibetan plateau. I like to think that they were the Yetis, and they evolved at higher altitudes, and they came down later on to lower altitudes. And this is quite interesting because they interbred with modern humans, because the genomes of many people in Southeast Asia, up to 4% in native Australians and Papuans, comes from Denisovans. When modern humans came into Europe, there was interbreeding mostly in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe, because 2% of the genes, of your genes and my genes, and of any genome that isn't purely African, will be Neanderthal. But there were other homins. Well, I mentioned there were some in Africa that we know very little about. There were these giants walking around in Northeast Asia, these hominins. There were tiny little hobbits in Flores in Indonesia and in the Philippines, and probably several more. So these all died out eventually. And Homo erectus was still living in retirement on the island of Java, maybe as recently as 50,000 years ago. It had got used to it had re-evolved to become a jungle creature after living on the savannah. Modern humans seem to have wiped out all the other ones, not really consciously, but mostly by weight of numbers, because humans are very good. They breed more quickly, and they occupy larger home ranges than Neanderthals. It's all very inferential, but the archaeology of humans and Neanderthals suggests that humans lived in larger groups, and that is a better insurance against extinction. And they roamed more across the landscape. So they would meet more humans and interbreed with more humans. And eventually they just took up all the territory. And the others were, retreated to marginal habitats and eventually couldn't survive any longer. But the way they seem to have survived was they became subsumed within the human landmass, because when Homo sapiens first evolved in Africa about 300,000 years ago or more, it was a very raw ingredient. We are human because we are the products of Homo sapiens, but also quite a few other hominins that we've interbred with along the way. We've all got a bit of Neanderthal, maybe a bit of Denisovan, and probably bits of other things as well that are knocking around in our genes that help us do things. The genes that help Tibetans live at very high altitude come from the Denisovans. That is the Denisovan heritage that is given to the human race. So you're right, because we live where the only human species left, we tend to think it's always been like that. But no, that's a very new, unusual condition.
Interesting, fascinating. Now, thinking ahead, I read a piece that you wrote for the Scientific American back in November, I believe, on human extinction. And though not anytime soon being a relative term, considering that the span of history is 4.6 billion years, you mentioned that it would likely arrive at some point. And can you tell us a little bit about your views on the future of our species?
Yes. In the book, I wasn't very clear about when humans would become extinct. Sometimes I say it's tens of thousands, sometimes I say millions, sometimes I say sooner or later. Well, all species become extinct. The paleontologist David Raup, who is himself extinct, said that at a first approximation, there is no life on Earth because 99% of species are extinct. So all species become extinct. Now, mammal species live on average about 1 million years before they either die out or evolve into something else. Now, we've been around for, say, 300,000. Now, this doesn't mean in 700,000 years we're all going to go and die out, because this is an average. Now, we could all die out next week, or we could last for millions of years. It's just an average thing. However, my feeling is that human beings will become extinct quite soon, in the next few hundred to few thousand years. I think it's largely because we've used up all the resources that the Earth can offer, and that has made us very, very fragile as a species. We're also interdependent on each other, and to exist. Everything is connected to each other. There are several. I first thought about this. Is the fact in the book that although the human species is still increasing in numbers, that acceleration has slowed down. So in the 1968, which was the fastest time, the human species was expanding at more than 2% a year. Now it's down to just over 1%, and there will be zero population growth towards the end of this century, after which the species will decline, probably quite fast. Now, if you read various works by demographers, these are the scientists who model population trends, they will all disagree about when zero population growth will happen and how fast it will collapse afterwards, but they all agree that the population will peak, within 100 years or so, and it will decline after that. Now, there are various reasons for this. It's to do with the people are reproducing later. People cannot afford to have families. The education of women, which is the greatest single improvement to the human race for the past century, has contributed a great deal to the welfare, education, longevity, and general health of the human species, but it also will contribute to the decline in the long term. But I was wondering, why now? Why is it now that the human species is slowing down? What's stopping us? And then I thought there were some other facts in there, that the human species, one species, uses up to 40% of all the plant, what's called net primary productivity. That's all the stuff that plants make. Mm-hmm. That's one species out of all the millions on Earth. We use 40% of it. And something I read in a lovely new book that's out recently called Other Lands by Thomas Halliday, he was saying that although we haven't caused a mass extinction yet, in some ways the Earth looks like a post-extinction world dominated by very few species. So the humans, there are a lot of us, but then there are lots of birds and there are lots of bacteria. But humans, each individual is quite large. So 8 billion humans is a lot of mass. And this one species, humans, has 35% of all the mass of all the mammals on Earth. That's one species. And if you add in all our domestic animals, our dogs and cows and cats and cattle and sheep, that makes 94% of all the mass of land mammals. So the remaining 6% of meat is everything from aardvarks to zebras, elephants, giraffes, mice, gerbils, bats. They're all that tiny thing that's left over at the end after you've taken away all the humans and all our domestic animals. Now, 6 out of every 10 birds you will meet randomly is a chicken. So this shows you that we have totally dominated the resources of the Earth. Now, that's great, but how long can you keep that up? Economists tend to calculate wealth in terms of gross domestic product, which is a measure of how much is produced and how much is consumed. And it's measured in, percent growth, but that's a percent growth based on another percent growth, based on earlier percent growth. This is compound interest. And we can't keep going on like this. So another friend of mine, Ehsan Malsoud, has written a book called GDP, saying how growth does not account for or accommodate ecological cost to the environment. So I'm not a doomsayer. I'm not a kind of protester. Because I'm a paleontologist, I know that the world turns and, things change. However, if we're going to so in the long run, it doesn't matter. But in the short term, if we're going to keep our lives comfortable, we have to be more acutely aware of what we are doing and how fragile we have made the Earth's ecosystem, because it's all dominated by a few species and we're all highly interconnected. Now, we have the COVID pandemic. Now, lots of people have died, but really not many compared with the whole human species. But think how fast it spread around the world, and think what a cost it's had on our way of life and our economics and our way of doing things. And that's, in terms of the great pandemics of the past, that's not a big deal. But then I read another book, a fantastic book by Kyle Harper called Plagues Upon the Earth. He's a historian. He's interested in the plagues that hit the Roman Empire. But he started to look at the history of life and history of disease in general. And it turns out that human beings are particularly prone to disease. There are so many diseases in humans, even no matter how hygienic we are. Now, he said chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, don't have many diseases, even though they have no knowledge of hygiene and love to eat their own poo, and they never have a shower. But humans seem to have lots of diseases, and we've got more and more as we live closer and closer together in cities. And even though in the last century or so there's been a massive improvement in healthcare and hygiene, and nobody dies of smallpox or plague or measles anymore very much, we still are quite fragile to a lot of shocks. And it could be that something out of somewhere will destabilize the human population so that we will plunge towards extinction inevitably, no matter what we do. It's something called extinction debt. I have a scientist friend who's much better at math than I am, and he's working on what he calls the doomsday equation. And I'm feeding him various terms to put in his model. So we'll see what comes out of that. I'm amazed I can go to sleep at night, really.
Fascinating, but quite shocking as well. Those, especially that statistic that you just gave us about how much mammals. I mean, the percentage of the fact that we're basically us and our domesticated animals just make the entirety of or the majority.
Well, we could all make. Now, I love a steak, much as anyone, but I think the biggest single thing we could do to help the ecosystem recover would be to stop eating meat. If everyone stopped eating meat tomorrow, that would be a big help, because we wouldn't have cows, sheep, pigs, meat animals anymore. Maybe we'd have my wife would like to keep pigs, but as pets. She wouldn't eat them. I said, you can't keep pigs as pets. You have to turn them into sausages. That's why you have pigs. She said, no, they'd have names. And once you're introduced to it, our chickens have names. We couldn't possibly eat our chickens. I have chickens down the garden. Don't lay any eggs anymore. They're all retired chickens. But they all have names, and yet I have to clean them out,
Fascinating. So why don't we then turn to a lighter part of the interview and talk about your book, and I would say the audiobook, because I have to tell you, I read the book, and I love printed copies, of course, and but I also bought the audiobook, and it was an interesting and amazing experience, because it was the narration, but at the same time it had a couple of additional features to improve the experience of the reader. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, what happened was the publisher asked me if I'd like to record the audiobook, and I was very flattered, because normally I would expect them to ask an actor to do it, because during the pandemic there are a lot of out-of-work actors who would love to have the work. One of my other books was narrated the Accidental Species was narrated by very well by an actor. And I thought maybe they weren't going to pay me. That's why they were going to do it. But they did pay me in the end. But anyway, so I recorded it, and they said, and I live in, I live about 200 kilometers from London, out in the country. And they said, come to London to record it for 3 days. And I said, you do know there's a pandemic, don't you? I'm not coming. I'm not leaving. I'm not coming anywhere. I'm going to record it myself in my home studio, Flabby Road, where I do my recording. And they said, really? I said, I'll send you a demo. So I sent them a demo, and they said, fine, we'll let you do it. But also they let me record sound effects. They gave me complete editorial creative control. So I bought this amazing keyboard called a Korg Nautilus. It's a fan, because I play keyboards, and because of the pandemic, I'm no longer in bands, and I've discovered I love to record at home, with friends over the internet. But the Korg Nautilus is one of those keyboards that arrangers would have, or soundtrack people would have. It's got fantastic orchestral noises, but it's also got what sound people call Foley. It's got sound effects, people walking over gravel and pigs doing the crossword and things banging together and bottles popping and all sorts of explosions and amazing noises. And so I thought, I'm going to use this on the audiobook. And of course, when you buy a keyboard of this value, because I use it on the audiobook, I can make it tax deductible. You see, there is a method in my madness. So I did the audiobook, and they let me do all the sounds as well. And I'm very glad you enjoyed that, because a lot of people found them distracting. It seems to have caused a schism in the audiobook world. Most people don't like the audio, but you and a few other people who have obviously got great taste and discernment found that the atmospherics, the audio, the effects contributed. But one inspiration for this, to be slightly serious, was one of the inspirations for the whole book was a documentary by the great David Attenborough, who's been making wildlife documentaries for decades. Now, he's still doing it. He's over 90. But back in the late 1970s, when I was a teenager, just beginning to be interested in zoology, biology, he did a marvelous TV series called Life on Earth. Look it up. Now, at the time, this was groundbreaking. A lot of the things had never been filmed before. Now, this was the series which, near the end, he had him doing a piece to camera in front of a family of gorillas. It's a kind of iconic piece of TV. But it started, with the early Earth, how animals made bodies and how they grew into bigger things and came onto land. And it was so magisterial. And to an impressionable 15-year-old, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. But one of the great things about it was the music. The music was marvelous. I can still hear the French horn figure at the very end of the end credits just fading out. It haunts me to this day. So it's one reason why I thought this has got to have some sound. I wanted to make it feel, as a homage to the great TV documentary by David Attenborough that was one of the things that got me into studying science, and probably a lot of other people of my generation. It was the epic sweep of it, and the pictures, because a lot of these animals and scenes had, back in the 70s, had never been filmed before. So all these eye-popping drama of the natural world. So that was one inspiration for writing the book, but also for making the audiobook as immersive as I possibly could.
And so it was fascinating, and the combination of the sound effects and the music along with the narration it just made it perfect.
Thank you. I mean, I really does. I'm really so pleased to hear that. I really, really, really am. That is really great, because I did enjoy doing that, doing the audiobook so very much. In fact, they didn't edit very much of it. I had to send it off I did it on my home studio in GarageBand, and I sent it off to the production company. And all they asked me to do was to reduce the amount of deep, heavy breathing the dinosaurs were doing. they probably thought it was a bit creepy. So I scaled back on that track.
And before we conclude, I did want to ask you, we're going to be translating this interview for our Spanish-speaking listeners and communities and viewers. The book, is it gonna be available in Spanish at some point?
Yes, it will be available in Spanish from Urano Publishers, and I think it's 12th of April, although these things do vary. But I haven't seen a cover yet, but you can pre-order it. And it's available in a Spanish translation from April. It's already available in Dutch, German, Italian, and it's going to be available in many other languages. But Spanish is the next one, I'm pleased to say.
Perfect. Looking forward.
And Portuguese not long after that too. Perfect.
No, looking forward to that. The book is called A Very Short History of Life on Earth. It is by Dr. Henry G. Which will be published in Spanish, and you can pre-order now. We're going to share the link so you can actually get your copy. Dr. G, it was a pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much, and we hope to have you back again.
Well, thank you, and it's been a great pleasure. Cheers.
Cheers. For sure. Thank you so much.
Vive Radio, nos proponemos ser la emisora online calificada para ser la mejor opción en comunicación para usted. Nos preparamos en noticias, deportes, cultura, música y de entretenimiento general para que usted esté conectado todo el tiempo con nosotros. Caribe Radio ofrece el mejor servicio de comunicación digital para que las empresas se hagan visibles a diferentes públicos. Desde lo público trabajamos para el servicio y por el servicio social. Caribe Radio Online nos entrenamos día a día para brindar la mejor opción en producción de medios digitales. Caribe Radio, la radio del futuro.